Good afternoon, everyone. Wow. Is there anybody left outside? Welcome. Anyway, as you probably know, this is another lecture in a series that I'm giving, and my name is Don Campbell, and I'm really happy to be with you as your enrichment lecture, destination enrichment lecture. And some people have told me, and not so much my wife, that they enjoy my lectures because they find them to be fun as well as informational. My wife doesn't think so sometimes. Anyway, today we're going to take a look at Brazil and our interesting ports of call, Belém, Fortaleza, Natal, and Recife. We're going to first start with the country a little bit. Now, the country's name Brazil comes from the Brazil wood tree. It once grew plentifully along the coast of the country. And the wood actually produces, you can see it in this trunk here, a very deep red dye. So it's no surprise that Brazil, the name, means red like an ember. The dye was very highly prized or valued by the European cloth industry right after the country was founded. Now, Brazil wood was the earliest commercially exploited product from Brazil. Throughout the 16th century, massive, huge amounts of these trees were harvested by the local indigenous people. The timber was sold to European traders. Most of them early on were Portuguese, but there were also a few French in the mix. Anyway, in return for the trees, the local people received assorted European consumer goods. I'm not quite sure what the natives did with those consumer goods, but they got them anyway. Brazil is the world's fifth largest country by both geographical area and population. It covers nearly half of all of South America. To give you an idea of the size, it's 3,000 miles north to south and over 2,600 miles east to west. It's the only country in the world that sits or lies right on the equator, but it has contiguous territory outside of the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn. It's a pretty big place. Anyway, it's the largest Portuguese-speaking country in the world and the only one in the Americas. Over a third of the country is drained by the Amazon River and its more than 200 tributaries. Now, we're going to have a separate talk in a couple of days that's going to go through that, and it's going to talk about the whole Amazon basin, and we're going to talk more about Brazil's flora and fauna when we do that. Fossil records here date back to about 10,000 years ago, and they're evidence of early human occupation in Brazil. One of the earliest remains found was called the Luzia woman. She was discovered in a cave in Brazil, and her nickname was to pay homage to the famous African fossil Lucy, the Paleolithic woman. She was kind of a distant relative of this one and a very distant relative of most of us. Anyway, here's a recreation of what Luzia may have looked like. Anthropologists theorize that Luzia's predecessors migrated from Africa first out into Southeast Asia, and then after 10,000 years or so, they're believed to have crossed the Bering Sea over the land bridge when the Ice Age was in its glory, and then they headed south. The Mayorca, or Yora, were a pre-Columbian society that flourished near the mouth of the Amazon River. That's where Belém is today. Now, some human activity was documented at Belém that may have actually had little villages or something there, maybe as much as 3,000 years ago. The culture seems to have persisted all the way into the colonial era. The belief system of the Mayaro people is not really well understood, though it almost certainly involves some pretty important female figures. In their era, the women were more important than the men in many respects. Their iconography and their art portrays women in having shamanistic powers and priests, and also having the role of local shaman. Brazil's early inhabitants were primarily the nomadic Tupi-Guarani Indians or tribe. Descendants of these early people still live here in Brazil. They were semi-sedentary agriculturists, and they raised things like sweet potatoes and maize and beans. Survival International, that's a big group that reports on these sort of things, said there are about 100 uncontacted tribes worldwide. Those are people who have had no contact with the outside world. Brazil is believed to have the largest number of uncontacted people in the world. And in 2007, the National Indian Foundation here in Brazil estimated that the country has about 67 different uncontacted tribes. The thing that's amazing is that's up about 27 from just 2 years earlier. So earlier they had a lower number. Now they're starting to find more and more of these people. Over half of all of these uncontacted people live in either Brazil or Peru. This is a photograph that was taken during an overflight in 2008 of an unknown tribe in the Amazon basin, and it's near the city of Acre in Brazil. That area may have as many as 600 Indians who belong to 4 different groups or tribes. They live in pretty good tranquility in a territory that's pretty much untouched by the outside world. Their favorite food is tortoise, and the mounds of shells have been found in abandoned camps that have been seen by outsiders. The Indians used enormous bows and arrows. I mean, you have to realize these were people that lived literally off the land. One of these bows measured over 12 feet in length. It was a little hard to carry around because you kind of had to have it over your head. Anyway, many of the uncontacted groups located in the Amazon are today on the verge of extinction. And there's some of the tribes that only have a few individuals left. How do they know that? Well, they fly over them and they take pictures from the air. Now, when Columbus returned to Spain back in 1493, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were determined that all the discoveries that he made and people that followed him from Spain belonged to them. Now, they went and got a papal bull from Pope Alexander VI, and that document stated that all the lands to the west of a line just off the coast of Africa belonged exclusively to Spain. Well, that's a good deal. Anyway, in return, the Spanish promised that they would convert the heathen natives to Catholicism. Well, King John III of Portugal, he wasn't real happy with that, and he protested that as being an unfair division. It blocked the routes that Portuguese sailors needed to go through the Atlantic Ocean before turning east to go around Africa. In 1494, Spanish and Portuguese ambassadors met at Tordesillas, Spain, to resolve the dispute. And we talked a little bit about Tordesillas in the last presentation. The new line was drawn through a point that was 1,100 miles or so west of the Cape Verde Islands. The new limit cut through eastern South America from pretty much the mouth of the Amazon River to Sao Paulo. In effect, that agreement gave most of the yet-to-be-discovered Brazil to Portugal. Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral arrived in Brazil in 1500. Another explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, you remember him, he's the guy that America got named after later on. Anyway, Amerigo Vespucci explored the coastline for the king about a year later. Around the time of the Portuguese arrival, the territory here had an estimated indigenous population of about 7 million people. There were as many as 20,000 nations and tribes living in Brazil. King John III placed the new lands under the direct Portuguese control, and he appointed a governor general for the country. An order of Jesuit priests accompanied the first governor, and that was their whole role was to do the conversion to Catholicism. But the governor and the priest frequently clashed over the methods that were going to be used to convert the local natives. One side wanted them to be harsh, the other side wanted them to be more gentle. Anyway, the boundaries between the natives, the local natives in Brazil, and the Portuguese often were marked by wars and pretty straightforward, severe battles. Some of those involved some pretty large-scale military actions, and a lot of that happened both on land and water. This is an engraving by Theodore de Brie, and it illustrates a man named Hans Staden's account of his captivity in 1557. Staden was a German soldier and mariner who was captured by the Tupi. He reported that the Tupi practiced cannibalism and warriors captured from other tribes were eaten. The Indians believed, that, according to him, that that would allow them to absorb their enemy's strength. The Tupi are documented to have eaten the remains of their dead relatives. No comments? And they did that as a form of honoring their ancestors. Now, when the European conquistadors, primarily the Portuguese, their version of conquistadors, arrived, they attempted to stop the practice of cannibalism in the name of the king. They were somewhat successful, but not 100% at the time. Now, we're going to look at another local legend before we start to explore the rest of Brazil's pretty interesting history. The Muriquita is a carved green frog-shaped object. I'm not sure if it's carved or just shaped, but anyway, it was used as an amulet by the Tapajós women to prevent the disease and to avoid infertility. At midnight, these women would dive into the river, and they brought up a greenish kind of clay mud in their hands, and then they molded that into various forms, such as frogs, turtles, or other animals. Now, the frog was given by the female Amazon warriors. That's where the whole Amazon thing came from, were these women, the female Amazon warriors, as a gift to male Indians who annually visited their camp. Their camp was near Belém. They don't do this anymore, I don't think. Anyway, during one ceremony, which was dedicated to the moon, they mated with the warriors. Now, if a male child was born or came about as a result of that, he was entrusted back to the men who would then go off to raise him somewhere else. If it was a girl, the Amazon women would keep her with them. Today, this amulet is considered pretty much a sacred object, and it's believed to bring happiness and luck and also to cure almost every disease. They make great souvenirs. They're not really that big for the most part, and they will ensure that you get descendants. Watch for reproductions. Pun intended. And you can find them occasionally at the local markets. In the late 18th century, José da Silva Xavier led an uprising in Brazil. And basically, this was in response to a campaign by the Portuguese officials to recover overdue taxes that were owed by the people in Brazil. He argued for the emancipation of slaves, and he wanted full independence from Portugal. As you might guess, that didn't make the Portuguese government really happy, so he was condemned to death and beheaded in Rio de Janeiro in 1792, and that was done as a warning to other would-be revolutionaries. Today, he's considered to be one of Brazil's national heroes. By the early 19th century, Brazil had a queen, Queen Maria I. Actually, she was part of the Portuguese royal family. Queen Maria and her son, Prince John, fled from Portugal to avoid Napoleon's armies as they were tramping around in Europe. Basically, they moved to Rio de Janeiro along with a lot of other members of Portugal's nobility. That move established a monarchy that would span nearly 100 years in Brazil. From Rio de Janeiro, Maria's son, the future King John VI of Portugal, ruled his total empire, all of it, stuff over to the east, all around Africa, Portugal itself, and South America. In 1821, he decided that it was too hard to rule from Brazil because he had a really bad internet connection, I guess. Anyway, so he moved back to Portugal, and he left his son Pedro as a regent of Brazil. Pedro wasn't really happy. He defied his father's government in Lisbon, decided he wanted to be independent. So within a year, he issued a proclamation which declared that Brazil was a separate state, a separate empire. And he made it a constitutional monarchy. In 1824, he granted Brazil its very first constitution. The United States recognized the new empire the same year, and surprisingly, Portugal did the same shortly thereafter. But there's always going to be something that goes on anyway. Problems in Brazil led Pedro to abdicate in favor of his son. Pedro II. Well, the problem was Pedro II wasn't old enough to be emperor yet. So they actually had a regent that was going to oversee the country for about 9 years. Finally, Pedro II, or number 2 as you want to call him, was declared of age. He assumed his full duties as emperor. In 1835, a group of black slaves and freed men rose up against the government. It was called the Malay Revolt and is also locally known as the Great Revolt. 40 years later, slavery was finally abolished by a thing called the Golden Law. That ruling was enacted by Princess Isabel, Pedro II's daughter. Now, this is an early photograph of the royal family that was taken back in 1889. Isabel was the last monarch to rule Brazil, and her reign lasted until 1921. But the last 32 years of her reign was spent in exile in France. They had a coup d'etat. The military coup established the Republic of the United States of Brazil. That coup was led by Field Marshal Deodoro do Fonseca, and he became the country's very first de facto president. About that same time, Belém became a main exporting center for the Amazon rubber industry. The Opera House, or Teatro da Paz, is a testament to the city's former rubber fortunes. It's a beautiful building. As rubber plantations expanded, labor shortages increased. Rubber barons got local natives that they forced to tap the rubber trees, and slavery and human rights abuses were widespread. In some areas, 90% of the native population was wiped out. The rubber market for Brazil declined after plantations in Southeast Asia became much more efficient and effective. The Asian rubber trees, just so you know, were grown from seeds that were smuggled out of Brazil in 1876. Brazil was ruled by a dictator named Getulio Vargas from 1930 to about 1945. Then he was out of office for a little while, and he came back in 1951 and ruled until he committed suicide 3 years later. Now, he won the nickname the Father of the Poor, and that was because he had these policies that really supported the workers. He wanted to get the workers a better life. In 1960, the capital of Brazil was moved to Brasilia. They had a coup d'etat that happened in 64, and that saw the military seize power, and they stayed in power for about 21 years. Under the military regime, thousands of people were deported, imprisoned, tortured, and some of them murdered. Today, Brazil is a presidential democracy, and the first elected president took office in 1990. In 1994, Fernando Henrique Cardoso was elected. He was re-elected 4 years later, and he guided Brazil through a series of pretty severe financial crises. Cardoso ordered the declassification of many military files in 2000. They included information about a former military action that was called Operation Condor. The documents revealed that South American military dictatorships, mostly in Brazil, had kidnapped and assassinated many of their political opponents. Today, Brazil consists of some 27 federated units or states, and each state is headed by a governor who's elected by popular vote. In 2001 and 2002, the International Monetary Fund agreed to lend the country $30 billion US. That's B billion dollars. And that was over a period of 15 months to ensure that Brazil would not be dragged down by Argentina's economic problems. So Brazil has seen a pretty good resurgence to come back from what was really a very desperate time back, only 15 years ago. And right now they're considered to be one of the major economies in the world. We're going to take a quick look at our ports of call. Founded in 1616 by the Portuguese, Belém was the first European colony on the Amazon River. Belém is literally Portuguese for Bethlehem. Fort do Castelo overlooks the harbor entrance and the island of the Jaguars. I wonder what lived out on that island. Anyway, the fort was the only means the colonizers had to protect their new lands from the French and the Dutch occupation. The fort also was intended to hold down any uprisings by the indigenous people. In 1883, it was renamed Castel São Jorge, or simply Fort Castles, what they call it today. Its museum tells the story of the beginning of Portuguese colonization in the Amazon. And displayed inside are things like old pieces of artillery and ammunition, and it also displays ceramic Marajoara pottery and funerary urns, kind of like the one I showed earlier. The Vero Peso market was created in Belém back in 1688. Now this facility was basically established by the Portuguese to collect taxes on everything that was entering or leaving Amazonia. Every ship that came in or out had to stop here to pay their taxes. Today it's a market, and it's where you can find things like medicinal herbs, arts and crafts, seasonings, and spices. The Vero Peso market is also where acai berry merchants will sell their fruit to local juice shops. The acai palm is cultivated for two things, for its fruit as well as for the hearts of palm, but it has some other commercial uses. The leaves are made into hats, mats, baskets, brooms, and they also use them for thatch for their roofs. The trunk wood is very resistant to pests, so termites don't mess with it, and it's very often used for building construction. The seeds from the acai are ground for livestock feed, and sometimes they'll even use them as a component for soil additives for their potted plants and so on. Fortaleza's history began in 1500 when a Spaniard landed and named the new land Santa Maria de la Consolacion. But because of the Treaty of Tordesillas, his discovery was never recognized. Well, thanks, Mr. Explorer, but no thanks. Anyway, European colonization started about 100 years later when the Dutch built a fort that they abandoned just 17 years later. The Portuguese renamed that fort the Fortress of Our Lady of the Assumption, and around it, originally there was a little village, then it was a town, and then the city that became known as Fortaleza. The fortress, by the way, is still in use as a military base. Teatro José Alencar was officially opened in 1910 in Fortaleza. It was built in the Art Nouveau style. All of those cast iron parts that you see that are part of the framing and the balconies and so on that, basically the structure that makes up that theater were brought here from Glasgow, Scotland. The theater is named after the Brazilian 19th century novelist and poet. His name was de Alencar, and he was considered to be one of the most famous and influential Brazilian romantic novelists. He began or started a tradition here that was known as Indianism. And it was called that because there is always an Indian as a protagonist in his stories. This old lighthouse, which is just to the left of this picture, was built by slaves between 1840 and 1846. It's one of the oldest buildings remaining in Fortaleza. The lighthouse was the main navigation source for approaching ships until about 1957. And the local people actually called it the Eye of the Sea. In 1982, they did a little bit of a refurbishment and the lighthouse became a museum. 22 years later, it was all but abandoned. Artifacts and exhibits from inside were moved into storage, so they're no longer there. And now the lighthouse is pretty much falling into disrepair, and the building structure needs some really serious, tender loving care and refurbishment. Now, what makes good souvenirs? Well, there's a lot of things you get in Brazil and the ports that are here, but Fortaleza's Ensetur Tourism Center is one of the region's best places to shop for local handicrafts. It looks a little unusual for a market. And at first sight, you probably wouldn't figure out or wouldn't imagine that this colonial building was created as the city's first public jail. The old prison today is a beautifully colonial building. It's covered with a custard colored, kind of a yellowish, you can see it here, stucco. And of course, all the inmates are gone. Anyway, in addition to the handicraft market, it also houses the Museum of Art and Culture. Fortaleza is known for its lace. Now, the Portuguese colonists brought their native tradition of weaving to Brazil in the early 17th century. The Brazilians still sing a folk song that goes a little bit like this, and I'm not going to sing it, I'll just give you the words. Hey, lace maker, hey, woman making lace, if you will teach me to make lace, I will teach you to fall in love. That's kind of nice. Labrinto, or the labyrinth lace, gets its name from the complex process used to produce it. 3 or 4 threads are unwoven from a piece of percale or linen or even organdy. They'll literally pull these threads out a little bit, and then the designs are achieved by reinforcing the pattern with linen thread, and the cloth is finally very stiffly starched and stretched on a frame. Other favorite merchandise that you can get at the Enchanteur include things like wood carvings, baskets, and clay figurines. The village of Natal, whose name translates to nativity in Portuguese, was founded on Christmas Day in 1599. It's located just outside the Fort of the Holy Kings. The fort city and the surrounding areas were occupied by Dutch forces from 1633 to 54. And then after that, Portugal retook them. The sun shines here, to give you an idea how pleasant this place is, for about 3,000 hours each year. So if you take out nighttime, that means every day is a pretty nice day in Natal. And that gave Natal the informal title as City of the Sun. Nearby, there are literally dozens of white sand beaches. This place has beautiful, beautiful beaches. And they've given the city its second unofficial name, the City of the Dunes. As a result of the climate and the beaches and everything else, tourism here has become one of the most important segments of the local economy. As a result of the soil here being very sandy, Natal never became a successful producer of sugarcane. For over 200 years, the local economy was based on raising cattle. And that was because they could get into the dry interior lands. Today, the fishing industry is strong, along with the cultivation of tropical fruits, especially things like mangoes and guavas and cashews. In fact, the largest cashew tree in the world is located in a neighborhood south of the Natal city center. To give you an idea, this picture doesn't really do it justice, and I just don't know how you ever get to where you could do that without going up in space. Anyway, this thing has a circumference of 500 meters. That's about 1,650 feet. That means that it's about 500 feet across. That's a big tree. Well, actually, it's out of one rootstock, and I think there's a whole lot of trunks underneath it, but it's considered one tree. Anyway, it's 70 times the size of your average run-of-the-mill household cashew tree. It's so big that you need a plane to fly over it to see it all at one time. This cashew was planted by a fisherman back in 1888, and he died at the age of 93 under the shadows of the tree. In 1994, this cashew tree was entered into the Guinness Book of Records as the largest in the world. Founded in the early 1600s, Recife began as a colonial fishing settlement and a way station for Portuguese sailors and explorers. It got the name Recife because out offshore there's a long reef that runs parallel to the shoreline and actually encloses and protects the harbor. Now, in spite of some reports, the reef itself is not coral. It's pretty much an ancient remains of a beach, so it's sandstone that has just been compacted over centuries, has become hardened and is now more like stone. At the time, Portugal had the strongest slave market in the world. From the 16th to the 19th century, many slaves arrived from Africa at the marketplace in Recife. As a result, this area, primarily this area, that surrounding Recife, has the most African culture in South America. And today you can see that in the local dance, music, and the foods. Not too long after Recife's founding, the Kahal Zur Israel Synagogue was created by Sephardic Jews. Now you have to understand, when the Spanish Inquisition was going on back in Spain and Portugal, a lot of these people fled to the Netherlands. And then from the Netherlands, they came to Brazil when the Dutch invaded northeastern Brazil and kind of took it away from the Portuguese. When Portugal reconquered the new land, they got it back from the Dutch, the Jews moved north with the Dutch. Well, they didn't just move a little ways, they moved a long ways, because they moved all the way north to help found New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. So that's a long trip. Anyway, the synagogue originally was built in 1646, but the original building was destroyed and it was rebuilt on its original site. It's been restored as a museum. Today, the Recife Synagogue is considered the oldest continuing use synagogue in the Americas. The fort at 5 Points was built by the Dutch in 1630, and since it dominates the harbor, you may see it as we go into the Recife harbor. It was rebuilt. They took off one of the points. Why? I don't know, because I guess it was too hard to have 5 points. Anyway, they took off one of the points, and now the Portuguese, after they got it back, they renamed it Fort St. James in the late 1600s. The last restoration of the fort to pretty much what it's like today was completed in 1982. And today the fort houses things like an auditorium and the Recife House of Culture. And they have a museum with a collection of approximately 1,300 archaeological pieces and about 200,000 photographs, prints, maps, and plans. So if you have a little bit of spare time on your hands in Recife, you can go just look at maps till your heart content. Now, what do you want to eat in Brazil? I'm getting hungry just thinking about this. You have to, if you get a chance, you have to try the local foods. Now, feijoada is a national dish of Brazil. Actually, it has a lot of Portuguese background to it, but feijoada is a national dish here. It's a delicious combination of rice, black beans, and pork. You can even see feijoada maybe up at the Terrace Cafe buffet some night. We'll have to talk to Farid and see if he can put it on the menu. Anyway, you can't get more local than feijoada. Another dish that's really appreciated by visitors is called capuaçu. Its ingredients come from a tree that's found only in the Amazon forest. Now, capuaçu trees, you can identify this soup because it is a very, very strong smell and it's very sour. So if you're into really potent things, this might be something you want to try. Anyway, the pulp from the tree's fruit is also extracted to make things like juices and candies and jellies and, of course, the all-famous liqueurs and ice cream. And I'm not sure if it has a really strong smell and a really potent taste when you try it. Maniçoba is a dish from the Amazon region and one of the highlights of local cuisine. Now, this one is a little bit hard to understand because it's made with the leaves of a manioc cassava plant. After they take the leaves, they grind them into a fine powder, and then they boil it for a week. And that's to remove the hydrogen cyanide that they contain. I guess if they only cook it for 5 days, you might have a problem. Anyway, they also add smoked ingredients such as bacon, sausage, and salted pork, and all of that's added to those boiled leaves. The dish is served with rice and sometimes some soft-boiled cassava root that here they call farina. All right, so you're not into this, but you're going to have feijoada, so what do you want to have to drink? Well, in Fortaleza, there's a unique museum that's devoted to cachaça. Now, that's a liqueur that's about 40% alcohol. It's pretty similar to rum. It's the most popular distilled alcoholic beverage in the country. But you can't confuse it with rum. It's a distilled spirit that's made from sugarcane juice, where rum is distilled from molasses that results from the whole process of refining sugar. The museum here is part of the Ipueca distillery that was once owned by the Tellus family. They began producing cachaça back in 1846. Their museum displays things like all this old equipment that was used to produce the alcohol. And one of the things is a very rare 18th century ceramic alembic, got that right, alembic vessel. Now, alembic vessels basically, that's a container that has a little beak cap or a head on it that's used to distill things. And so those of you that are into making moonshine, I'm sure you know what that is. But it's a distilling process tool, and that helps purify and refine the liquid. Among the favorite drinks in Brazil is a thing called caipirinha. It's made with cachaça, usually served just before the feijoada. Now, it's not served just so you will try the feijoada. It just happens that's when they serve it. It's a pretty potent lime cocktail that you can sometimes get here on the ship. Now, how did the cachaça come about? Well, beginning about 500 years ago, the slaves that were out in the fields started to drink liquid that was fermented from the cane crushing areas. So they would find this juice that was there when they were crushing the cane, and it would just kind of ferment and, turn into, I guess you'd call it almost like a cane wine. Anyway, they would start to drink it, and the owners figured out that must be pretty good stuff. So Dutch slave traders began production of the drink, and they did that just in the northern part of Brazil. Now, they used the cachaça as a currency. Well, Portuguese weren't really happy with that, so they issued a royal decree prohibiting the sale of liquor. Well, that didn't make much of a difference because by the end of the 17th century, it became the second largest industry in Brazil, just behind coffee. I guess you had to have the coffee after you had too much of the cachaça. Anyway, today there is an ambitious export program that aims to increase the annual exports to some 40 million liters within the next 5 to 10 years. The tradition of brewing in Brazil goes back to the German immigrations in the early 19th century. The first breweries that were opened here were opened in about 1830. Bohemia, it's a brand of beer, claims to be the first Brazilian beer, and actually it is the oldest beer that's still in production here. Brazilians enjoy drinking locally brewed beer that's called chopp. It has a heavy Germanic influence. Now, during Carnival, unfortunately, we're not here for Carnival, but if you get a chance to come back to Brazil during Carnival, I'll give you a little bit of a statistic here. During Carnival, there's kind of an explosion of beer consumption in Brazil. Within 4 days, that's the 4 days of Carnival, over 400 million liters of suds are consumed. And then the next 4 days, they drink all the coffee. Brazilian coffee, anyone? Sugar was the country's main export crop until the 19th century when coffee replaced it. The first coffee bush was planted in Brazil in 1727. Now, according to a legend, the Portuguese wanted a cut of the coffee market, but they couldn't get seeds from the neighboring bordering French Guiana. And that was because the governor up there was unwilling to export any of the seeds. He had kind of a lock on coffee production in the local area. Well, the Brazilians sent a diplomat on a mission to resolve a border dispute with French Guiana. And so he got up there, and one of the first things he decided he had to do was to get some of these seeds. So he seduced the governor's wife. Well, as a result, she secretly gave him a bouquet of flowers that was spiked with seeds from coffee plants that he could smuggle home. Coffee remains a really important export, but the importance in Brazil has really dropped over the last 50 years. Coffee exports as a percentage of Brazil's total exports were, I guess, somewhere around 50% from 1850 to the 1960s. In 2006, coffee exports accounted for only 2.5%. Kind of thinking about coffee, the locals here like theirs very strong, I mean really, really strong, and sweet, and they serve it in very small cups. The culture here dictates that if someone offers you a cup of coffee, you must not refuse it. it's considered to be an affront if you say, no, I'm sorry, I don't want any coffee today. All right, now you've had your meal, you've had your alcohol, you've had your coffee. What about dessert? Well, try the Brazilian truffles. Those are called brigadeiros. Oh, God, Susie's gotten into the chocolates again. Anyway, we got, yes, you did. Anyway, thank you very much. I've enjoyed being with you this afternoon. And what I would like to do is anybody that has questions and stuff, you can meet me. Well, we'll kind of wander out toward baristas and we can go have a cup of coffee or whatever out there. And I'd like to thank you, and I'll see you again in a couple of days.